Good afternoon and welcome back. As you just heard, I am the second straight NCCI economist that you get on stage. So I think it's only fair we start with a piece of economics trivia. We have a standard system we use to classify different types of economic research. And our field of labor economics is actually officially titled Labor and Demographic Economics. And that's because I think that really is very central often to understanding the labor market, is what the demographics look like and how are they changing. And it's in that spirit that we're going to spend the next half hour. So we're going to look at this presentation really at two big demographic elements. We're going to talk first about population growth. What are the size and sources of population growth in the US in the recent past and looking forward? And as part of that discussion, we'll talk about what's happening in different states and regions. How and why do some parts of the country differ from others? In the second half of the presentation, we'll move from the population to the workforce. And we'll focus in not just on overall growth, but how the age profile of the population and thus the labor force is changing. One big theme of this, as you heard a little bit earlier today, is the aging workforce, but there's more nuance to it than that, and we'll get into that a lot more in a little while. And we'll close in this workforce section by examining the connection between worker age and injury frequency. That's where we'll move kind of from a wide lens into a more narrow focus on work injuries and workers' compensation. And after that, you'll get to hear a lot more about demographics and claims from Paul in the following half hour, and even a little bit from Raji as well in our last afternoon session. So let's start with our discussion of population and regional growth. How much there's been, what are the drivers, what are our future expectations, and how regional growth can differ from national trends. We'll start simply with how much growth has there been. The US population right now is about 342.5 million. 20 years ago, on the left-hand side of this chart, we were a little bit under 300 million. So just 1% growth per year would be about 3 to 3.5 million. And you can see that we're below that in most of the last 20 years. Two things on this chart I want to call your attention to. One, absolute growth has mostly trended down from about 2005 to 2020. Second, we do see some fluctuations year to year, and in particular, we see a few years of high growth in the last few years, 22, 23, and 24. Making sense of both of those, we can look at this as really a mix of two very distinct forces. And you can see that here. Population growth in the US is really coming from natural change, which is the demographer's term for simply how many people are being born and how many people are passing away each year, and net immigration, how many people move into the country and move out of the country each year. You can see the natural change in orange is the main driver of population growth through about 2013, but it is also the main reason that we've been trending down, and it's actually been very low in recent years in the 2020s. Fluctuations in net immigration explain most of the up and down year to year, and indeed actually explain a lot of the growth that we've seen in recent years in the 2020s. We'll come back to this picture about where we expect national growth to be going, but actually, Stephen threw me for a bit of a loop about 90 minutes ago. The next slide we're going to show is a state map, and I was planning to ask you all what you think is the fastest growing state in the country. You know, stay on brand. You may recall Stephen made a resolution, unknown to me, that he was going to stop doing that. Now, you were all here for the rest of the hour. He doesn't remember that either, so it's probably pretty safe to do it. So everybody take a second and think about, what do you think the fastest growing state in the country was over the last 10 years? And if you like, we can honor Stephen by putting the map up, and you can all raise your hands if you picked Idaho. Idaho is the darkest orange state on this map, representing the fastest growth from 2015 to 2025. Some other guesses some of you may have are probably also some of the dark orange states. You see Utah and Nevada around Idaho. You see Texas, Florida, and the Carolinas. You also see a little bit of blue on this map from states that lost population in the last 10 years. West Virginia is the largest decline in percentage terms. Illinois is pretty light blue, but it is a relatively large state, and so it actually had the largest decline in absolute terms. Other large states, California and New York, are pretty much white, do not gain or lose much population. To give a little bit more perspective, we can look at how this compared to growth over the previous 10 years. And I think these two maps are both similar and different in important ways. One way in which they're similar is, I think, in the patterns of relative regional growth. Both maps tend to be darker orange in the South and West than in the Midwest and Northeast regions. However, in the 2005 to 15 map, we do see more dark orange states and very little blue. Overall, a little bit faster growth in that decade. The map has gotten lighter and sometimes bluer in the past decade, and we expect that to be true also going forward. Now, to highlight some of the drivers of this regional growth, we're going to go from a 50-state map and aggregate up to the different regions of the country. And we'll look at that here. We see here now the 4 census regions of the country in different colors. And you can see most population growth has been in the South. You also see we're doing the same thing in this picture as we did for national growth by region, dividing it into what's coming from natural change and what's coming from net migration. I am using a different word here, migration rather than immigration, because at the state or regional level, a big part of what's driving growth is not people moving in from out of the country, but people moving from one part of the United States to another. And you see very different patterns between immigration and this internal domestic migration. You can see here that net immigration is a growth factor for all 4 regions. But at this level of aggregation, the South grew a lot from internal migration at the expense of the other 3 regions. That's probably a pretty familiar story to many people. Some of you may have lived that story. I lived that story. 10 years ago, I lived in Michigan, since moved to NCCI and relocated to South Florida, so I'm a little bit of one of these dark green pixels moving out of the Midwest and dark purple pixels moving into the South. So now let's look a little bit more detail at each of the 4 regions. We'll start with the Midwest. It had relatively slow growth over the last 10 years. And this has been true not just in the last 10 years, but for a long time. In both census divisions, which we now see shown separately in this map, we had domestic outmigration that partially offset growth from natural change and from immigration. We see that most strongly in what's officially known as the East North Central, or for some of you, maybe the Big Ten region. And a lot of that's coming from Illinois, the largest state in the region. It's also the largest contributor to this domestic outmigration. And you'll recall it was light blue state on the map. We see a pretty similar story in the Northeast. Natural change is small for both divisions. In fact, in New England, it is positive, but you can barely see it at all. And domestic outmigration is partly or even completely offsetting international immigration. As we saw for the region with Illinois, the Middle Atlantic, whose largest state is New York, has had large enough domestic outmigration the last 10 years to pretty much offset growth from international immigration and from natural change. Now, the South is a different story, as we saw before. It's the fastest growing region in the country. It's been adding population share not just in the last 10 years, but pretty much since the invention of modern air conditioning. And we can, again, even in the South, see very different patterns from the 3 different census divisions. The South Atlantic is drawing in people both from other countries and from the rest of the country in high numbers. The East-South Central has slow growth, and like New England, has pretty much no growth from natural change in the last 10 years. And the West-South Central, which by population is majority Texas, has balanced growth from natural change, from international migration, and from the rest of the country. The 2 census divisions in the West are very different regions, as we saw on the state map. The Mountain is a fast-growing region by percentage. We saw that with our champion Idaho, as well as Utah, Nevada, and Arizona, mostly from domestic migration followed by natural change. In the Pacific, largely California, but also Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, Hawaii, we see outmigration offsetting growth from natural change and immigration. And at this level of aggregation, some of that outmigration is not going just to other regions, but also into the mountain region, mountain division within this region. So overall, we're seeing domestic migration driving regional differences, right? People are moving within the US into the south and into the Mountain West from other parts of the country, which is partly offsetting growth from immigration everywhere. Now let's go back to that national picture and look forward. You saw here that in the last 20 years, we've experienced population growth both from natural change and from immigration, but that growth from natural change is declining. What do we expect to see in the coming years and the coming decades? Now what you see is a projection. We took this particular one from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, but other mainstream projections are very similar, that in the US, deaths will exceed births by 2030 and in every year thereafter. Going forward, not just a lot of, but all population growth in the US will have to come from potential immigration. And that decline in natural change is coming from both directions. We have an increasing share of older Americans, and we also have smaller birth cohorts. People are, on average, there are long-run trends towards people having fewer children and also having children later, both of which cause fewer births in each year. And you've seen this pattern happening at different rates in different regions. In some of the regions of the country, you see that natural change is already around 0 in the past 10 years, let alone in the next 10 and beyond. So what we've seen so far is slow population growth in the US, about less than 1% over the last 20 years, and increasingly driven by immigration as growth from natural change is going towards and eventually below 0. At the regional level, we see domestic migration is the main driver of regional differences as that accelerates growth in some regions and partly offsets growth from immigration and natural change in other regions. Now, in the next part, we're going to take what we know about population change and focus in more carefully on what's happening to the labor force and what's likely to happen in the next few years. We're going to start by taking a closer look at how the age profile of the population and labor force have changed and show then, going forward, how that can affect potential work injuries. So let's start by putting up that 1% that we've talked about before. Now, since we're talking about the labor force, I'm going to show, instead of overall population that you saw before, just the adult population, which is why this line is a little bit closer to 1% than what you saw before. Now, labor force growth over the last 20 years has been slower than that. And you saw that from Stephen as labor force participation amongst adults has gone down. Now, to give more perspective on this slow growth environment, let's look at the 20 years before that as well. You can see from 1985 to 2005, population growth was a little bit faster than it has been in the last 20 years. And because of a younger population and increasing participation amongst women, the labor force was growing faster than that. So seeing these overall numbers, the labor force in the last 20 years has been growing slowly, much less than 1% a year, and only half as fast as it had in the 20 years prior. And to get a sense of exactly what's driving that change, we're going to take the next few minutes and look at how the population and labor force has changed at given ages over this same period. So we're going to start here about 20 years ago in 2005. And what this chart is now showing you is how many people there were at every age in the United States in 2005. So you can find yourself. I'm in college here. I'm in between that 16 to 24 dotted line. I don't know if there's anyone in here who's not 21, but if so, sorry, you're not here yet. We'll meet you soon. And you can see the largest cohorts at this time are people in their 40s, in sort of the center of their working lives, and people in their teens, just entering or about to enter their working lives. You already know these as sort of the peak of the baby boom generation and the millennial generation, but you can call them whatever you like. In AIS terms, we might call them people who can get their dine and disco outfits from the back of their closet versus our friend Dan Cunningham who had to order his last week, as you heard this morning. Now, what we really want is not just the population, but the labor force. And so now what we're showing here in the bright color are the number of people at each age who are in the labor force, defined as people who are employed or who are actively looking for work. And you can see how that differs from the now faded blue as we go from left to right. You can see that there are no children in the labor force. As we move between those first dotted lines from 16 to 24, participation rises. I don't have an on-campus job this year, so I'm faded out. More people attached to the labor force in these prime working years from 25 to 54 in the center of the chart. Declining participation as people start retiring in that 55 to 64 range. And then most, but certainly not all people, out of the labor force by age 65. And these people who remain on beyond traditional retirement age are going to be a key demographic that we're going to look at as we go through these next few slides. Now, we're not really just interested in a snapshot of 2005. We want to see how things have been changing over the next 10 years and the next and the next. And so what we have here in the orange line is the number of people at each age 10 years later in 2015. You can see here, just by looking at the difference between these orange and blue lines, a few things really jump out. By 2015, there are a lot more people in their 50s and 60s. There's a smaller, but still substantial increase in the number of young adults, driven partly by generational change and partly by immigration profile. You can actually see that that orange line peaks above where the blue line was 10 years ago, right? It's not just people aging, it's also young people moving into the country. And you can see a slight decline in the population in middle age as that large baby boom cohort is replaced by a smaller Gen X cohort at the same age. And to make it easier to visualize these differences, on the right, we're going to plot the net change directly. So you can see the orange bars representing more people at a given age in 2015, or in some cases, the blue bars representing fewer. And this is probably why some of you are thinking, man, I've been hearing about population aging for a long time. Even 10 to 20 years ago, this is a really important thing, as a lot of people were nearing or achieving traditional retirement age. This big group of orange bars on the right-hand side of that right-hand chart. And now we can move from the population, again, to the labor force. And we see the workforce changing in much the same way as the population. A lot more workers 55 and up, with some growth among people in their 20s and early 30s, more than offset by fewer workers in their teens, in their 40s, and early 50s. Although workforce aging isn't quite as striking as population aging, that area under the chart in the right-hand side of the bottom right isn't as big as the top right, more than 100% of all labor force growth between 2005 and 2015 was among workers 55 and older. Workforce aging really was the dominant story. In the last 10 years, it's a little bit more complicated. So we can do that by looking now at 2015. Now you see the population peaks are in their 50s and mid-20s. And we can draw another line to compare that to where we are now. In the last 10 years, of course, we've seen the pattern shift to the right again, but now that increase in younger adults was a little bit larger because, as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, immigration has played a larger role in growth in the last 10 years. Aging is still the biggest population story, as you can see on the top right, but that big growth in the number of people about 25 to 45 matters a lot too. And you can also see on this chart what we talked about earlier. We've started to see in the last few years smaller birth cohorts than there were a decade ago. And once again, we can do the same thing for the workforce. And now, when you look at these two right-hand charts, you do see a different pattern. Because a lot of the population aging in the last 10 years have been amongst people over 65, most of whom have retired, the biggest contributor to labor force growth in the last 10 years, rather than population growth, has been that early to mid-career group. Workforce aging is still a big part of the story, but it's not the biggest part of the story, and it's much too simple to say it's the whole story. And once again, this big increase in early to mid-career workers is coming from three sources. The most obvious is the millennials aging into this prime working age. The second, as we said, is from new immigrants. And the third is what you heard from Stephen, which is that prime age participation is up and near record highs. So there's more people coming in from the sidelines as well. The next thing we can do is look at where we're going by now using where we are now and labor force and population projections from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And moving forward, I think there are three main features of population change. One is a continued big increase in the older population, now coming from people entirely 65 and up, mostly 70 and up. A smaller increase in the number of middle-aged adults, as the millennials like me have to accept that middle age now means us. And third, a continued decline in the number of children per year moving forward. And that comes from three sources. The first two we already talked about, long-term trends towards people having fewer kids and people having the children they do have later in life. And the third comes back to that middle age point. The millennials like me are also done having kids, and the people having kids now are a smaller cohort and thus having fewer overall children. But what we really want to be focused on for work and for workers' comp is where is the labor force going, not just the population. And in this picture, I think, again, there are a few major implications. First of all growth is likely to be coming from this group past traditional retirement age and from this middle age group from about 40 to 55. That's the only green on this chart. We're actually going to have fewer workers in the last 10 years of their traditional working ages, the purple in between those sets of dotted lines. And also going forward, that lesser number of new entrants from fewer young people is not just a next decade issue, but an ongoing issue. You can see that from the population change chart, right? It's not just people about to enter the workforce in the next decade, but in the decade after that and after that. So the key points in this section, the labor force has grown slower than the population, largely due to aging, and that in contrast to the last 10 years, in which a lot of labor force growth came from people in the early to middle parts of their careers, growth in the next 10 years will be coming from workers 45 to 54 and 65 and up. And I want us all to keep those age ranges in mind as we get into our last section about frequency. So we'll start with the frequency that you saw briefly this morning in the State of the Line dialogue. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics measure of cases per worker in the Survey of Occupational Injuries and Illnesses, which is long enough to say that I'm going to follow their lead and call it SOI for the rest of this presentation. Now, SOI was kind of a side note for Dan and Nadej, but it's very important for us, for this presentation, for one reason, which is that they publish estimates not just of overall frequency, but of frequency by age. At NCCI, we have a lot of information about claims and about workers who are injured, and Paul's going to talk to you a lot more about that in the next few minutes. But with the various BLS data sets and surveys, they're able to construct a measure not just of injuries by demographic, but exposure by demographic, and that's what we're going to take advantage of in a minute here. Now, the drawback of using BLS data instead of our own is that they use a slightly different sample of workers and a slightly different definition of injuries. So we want to make sure that these are comparable enough to draw insights from before we get too far. The good news, as you probably guessed from hearing Dan and Nadej talk, is that I think this is going to work. Every state has a story, but every overall frequency was telling basically the same story. And that's what we're going to see here. When we look at NCCI's overall measure of frequency per worker, adapted here from our annual statistical bulletin, you see pretty similar results to what you see in SOI. The other thing is that SOI is a national data set, and Donna showed you some differences about NCCI states versus other parts of the country. If we restrict the SOI data to only NCCI states, it becomes even more similar to our own data. And we look at just these two lines we have left, they're not just pretty similar, but they seem almost right on top of each other. So we feel pretty good that insights we can glean on a demographic basis from SOI are going to be relevant to workers' comp, to us at NCCI, and to all of you. which is a long way to get into what exactly do we see. And this is, I think, the simplest and maybe the most important takeaway from this frequency by age piece. You all know that with occasional blips, frequency has been declining for a long time. And what you see here is that over the last decade, this has been primarily a mid-career worker phenomenon in green. The oldest workers' frequency has been declining in purple, but not by nearly as much. The youngest workers' frequency has been flat and actually came up a little bit in the last few waves. And because I'm sure a few of you have this question, the reason that the last two data points on this slide are for combinations of 2 years is because of a change to the SOI data. It went from being an annual survey to a biennially published survey, and so this is the data that we have. So you can see not only do mid-career workers have the largest frequency declines in the last decade, but in the most recent years, they have by far the lowest absolute frequency. And we can continue to investigate this by looking at finer age bands, which we'll do now. It probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone that we see massive differences between 16 to 24 and 25 to 34. That older group is more likely to be established in career track jobs, they're more mature and experienced, and they're less likely to be short tenured workers. This is a big difference we see and kind of expect to see. We move forward a decade to 35 to 44, and we see pretty similar patterns between these two groups. These are actually now our two lowest frequency age bands. And again, I want to remind you, this is where a lot of growth came in the labor force in the last 10 years, among these low frequency groups, among these very sharply declining frequency groups. As we move to 45 to 54, we see an increase in frequency. And remember again, from what we showed earlier, this is an important distinction to look at moving forward, as there are a lot of older millennials like me who are about to age from this purple group to this yellow group over the next several years. Frequency ticks up again as we move forward to 55 to 64, suggesting the aging workforce really does correspond to more injuries of certain types. Now, as we move to 65 and up, it becomes more difficult to interpret because, as we've seen, most people are out of the labor force by this age. However, amongst the people who stay in the labor force, we see rising injury rates from 2016 to 2019, and then after a pandemic dip, which corresponded to a lot of excess retirements, increases again in the most recent two waves. Because we've seen in the last section, this group is and will be an increasingly important part of the labor force, coupled with this upward frequency pressure. It's an important demographic to watch and to understand, and you're going to hear more about that from Paul in just a couple minutes. So we can look at all of these now together and review what we've seen. Very high frequency for the youngest people, very low frequency for people earlier in their careers, frequency starting to rise as people get into the second half of their career, and that 65 and up group going from the lowest absolute frequency a decade ago to the highest frequency, second highest frequency in the most recent wave. So overall, that frequency decline is much more pronounced for workers in the mid-career, and incidence rates are higher amongst groups where we expect to see the most labor force growth in the future. I'll close just by reinforcing some of the highlights from the last half hour. Population growth is slow in the US and increasingly dependent on potential immigration. Domestic migration is another major factor explaining regional change. The labor force has grown slower than overall population, largely due to aging, and that the patterns of labor force growth we've seen and will see can be impactful to work injuries as we're moving from changes that favor more workers who are relatively low frequency to ones where frequency is rising. There's a lot more we could talk about work injuries and demographics, and I am more than happy to talk to any of you over the next day about this, and I'm also very excited for you to see the rest of our afternoon session, starting basically right now with Paul. Thank you.